The death of George Floyd in Minneapolis in the United States of America has laid bare again the injustice and the oppression of Afro-American, of Black Americans in particular. The 46-year-old who's been shown in viral footage being kneeled upon at the knee of an officer who was arresting him for some sort of allegation of criminality. His death on a street has sparked rioting in America and raised this question again. And we are being offered many thoughts and ideas about this. But we need to look a little bit deeper about the history, about the problems that Black people in America have faced. This is not new. The death of Eric Garner in New York a few years ago, when he was in a chokehold and dying, brings back awful memories. Police officers shooting Black people suspected of crimes or otherwise, again, are known. The prejudice against Black people in the justice system and in all walks of life, whatever metric you use, pretty much always come back with the same result. Why is this? And what do we need to do about it? How do we stop it? Well, the suffering of Black people did not start in this decade, in the beginning of this century. You have to go back to the colonial projects 400-500 years ago, when Europe, as it was coming to its enlightenment, began to look for the new world. People like Columbus and so on, who were celebrated as heroes, started the process of colonialism and colonization. And then with the slave trade, where in their millions, hundreds of thousands, Black people from Africa were kidnapped and sold into slavery via Europe, into the Caribbean and the USA. And then we had a war of independence. And people like Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, or George Washington, who were all slave owners from amongst the founding fathers, didn't like the exploitation of the King of England or the United Kingdom and decided they wanted to break free. So what did they do? They drafted a constitution. This constitution basically continued with slavery. So there was no change. Many of them had many hundreds of slaves. The three I've mentioned certainly did. You will say, well, look, what about Abraham Lincoln? He abolished slavery. Sure, the Civil War in the 1860s in America, the point there was that federal law was not being observed. The issue was slavery. The point was federal law over state law, state rights over federal rights. Ultimately, the Confederate states of the South were defeated. But tell me, over 100 years from then, Black Americans were free to die for America, but could not sit in the same buses next to white people, could not go to the same school, could not go to the same schools, could not go and eat in the same restaurants, and so on. The prejudice, the discrimination was so clear, so obvious. And Muhammad Ali famously refused to go. He said, no Viet Cong, I think words to that effect, ever called him the N-word or something along those lines. He said, why should I go? I'm being oppressed here. People like Malcolm X and so on, we know the history. And so the history of oppression of Black people in particular, and latterly Latin American and Hispanics, it's something which is systemic. As one of the placards I saw from a young Afro-Caribbean man who said, how can I turn to a system which was never designed to protect me in Minneapolis in the recent days, summed it up nicely. So whatever metric you use, whether it's healthcare, education, opportunity, historically structural racism, systemic racism has affected people of color, Black people. And so when we look at this, how do we understand this? Many people will tell you all white people are to blame for this because it's whiteness. There are things like critical race theory, which have no Islamic input in them. Rather, they have analyzed and assessed this history and then come out with their own un-Islamic-based theories. Islam hasn't got any input in them. And they're not the correct basis to look at this. Of course, it's information. What is not from the Islamic jurisprudence, not based upon Islamic principles, is information. And whatever is consistent with Islam, like our ulama historically did, they took. But we do not take the right and wrong, halal and haram, what we should do, what we shouldn't do, based upon a premise, a framework, a reference point, which has no input from Islam whatsoever. So many people blame all white people. Is that correct? Is this right? Let's look at a few other examples before we come to conclusions about this. How did the Europeans treat the native, the real Americans? Over the centuries, they were annihilated. The beneficiaries of disease from European settlement. Look at the Inuits in Canada, again, the victims of European colonialism and a superiority complex. We look at what happened to the Aborigines in Australia into the last century. Look at how they were decimated. The Maoris in New Zealand. So it's not a one-off. There is a clear pattern. And the pattern is an enlightened, a democratic Europe and then America perpetrated these atrocities in the name of benefit, in the name of a superiority of culture, where people who were not white were subjected to this. But not every white person carries this sin. The concept of original sin, a doctrine of Christianity, is not something Islam endorses. Sure, most white people would have indirectly benefited, and many directly, from colonialism and from racism. But it was the political system, the legal system, that allowed, encouraged, and implemented the whole process of colonialism, segregation, and apartheid, which America has been certainly since even the American Civil War, and many will tell you it still exists. And let's look at some other examples. Would we say all Arabs are racist, even though there is a prejudice against non-Arabs in many parts of the Middle East? There was a recent rant by some ignorant Arab on media how Egyptians and other Arabs are superior to Bengalis and Pakistanis and so on. No, but the system in the Middle Eastern countries is one which has encouraged it and perpetrated it. So the rulers, those who implement it, those that enforce it, those that support it, you could blame. But the majority of Arab Muslims are not, or non-Muslim even Arabs are not racists. I've lived in the Middle East, I've travelled, I have friends, my own uncle has lived there, and his kafil has treated him like his own son. So this is something we have to understand. In India, Muslims are being targeted and have been targeted in places like Kashmir and across India for decades. In particular, it's come to the fore recently with the BJP government. But are all Hindus to blame for this slaughter? No, that will be lazy, lacking intellectual rigor, and quite frankly dishonest. Many Hindus are supporting Muslims, but the system has allowed it, and the system continues to allow it, albeit it's far worse now than it was before. It's a systemic problem. It's a democratic state, it's a secular state, it's a capitalist state. Look at China and the oppression of Muslims in China. This is something which we can see clearly, but would you blame every Chinese person as being anti-Muslim? That would be wrong too. Don't forget, Chairman Mao in the Cultural Revolution, they killed hundreds of thousands of Chinese. They were not Muslim. It is a political objective that they drive. Of course, Islam and Muslims are being targeted in China at a political level. So when we look at all of these things, the concept of race as a basis, or the concept of faith or any other characteristic used which is a basis for oppression and dhulm, is something that Islam does not endorse or accept. So the problem has been and is a political, ideological problem, not one based upon color, which deflects attention from the real source of the problem. And in this context, it's very important to reflect on a few ayat and hadith. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Rum, funnily enough, mentions بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ومن آياته خلق السماوات والأرض والاختلاف ألسنتكم وألوانكم إن في ذلك لآيات للعالمين. Verily among his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth and the difference of your languages and colors. Verily in that indeed are signs for men, human beings of sound knowledge. It is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's signs that we have different colors, different languages, and He created us this way. We're all descendants of Adam alayhi salam. And in this context, in Surah Al-Hujurat, after Fath al-Makkah, many of the Arab Quraysh who began to say horrible things about Bilal radiallahu an when he was selected to give the adhan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then revealed the ayah, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسُ إِنَّ خَلَقْنَاكُم مِّن ذَكَرٍ وَأُنثَى وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلِيمٌ خَبِيرٌ. O mankind, we have created you from a male and a female, Adam alayhi salam and Hawa alayhi salam, and made you into nations and tribes that you may know one another. Very the most honorable of you with Allah is the one who has taqwa, who has understanding, answering to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for any oppression or dhulm they will do. And verily Allah is all aware. So from the Islamic perspective, Islam not only legally destroyed it, but practically, by way of illustration, destroyed these concepts. And we see in Islamic history how the concept of racism at a legal level, at a political level, was dealt with, and prejudice. And again, with regard to the oppression of Muslims, for example, even in the apartheid state of Israel, the similar thing against Arabs and particularly Muslims. It is no different to apartheid in South Africa or the sort of apartheid you've had in America. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in terms of addressing the Ahlul Dhimma, and how the Prophet ﷺ said he would be a witness against people who harm the non-Muslims living under Islam, who are citizens of the Islamic state, of the Khilafah in history. And I am not going to look at it through rose-tinted spectacles. There were bad incidents and bad rulers in Islamic history, but compare the history of Islam over 1300 years when it ruled politically and contrast it to any other system of ruling and governance, whether it's the communist system in the last century and continuing with China, or the capitalist in this century. You find there is no comparison in between the two. Yes, there were injustices under bad Muslim rulers, for sure there were. We have to be honest and objective about this. But what we don't do is turn to things like critical race theory when we look at racism, or we look at CVE, countering violent extremism, which the Western countries have used, and now it's a global phenomena. Prevent policies in the UK view all Muslims and Islam from the perspective of suspicion. This is no different to CRT, which effectively nowadays views all white people as being somehow responsible for the ills which have been visited by a system which was for sure implemented by white people. The issue is one of political values and political belief and political ideology, which enabled, encouraged and allowed to do that, which enables, encourages and allows the oppression in China, in India, in Israel and in other parts of the world against people who are not deemed to be equal. If there are bad Muslims, there are good Muslims. If there are bad non-Muslims, there are good non-Muslims from the perspective of worldly thinking. We have to be honest and accept that. And therefore, let's not deflect from these issues. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, in Surah Ibrahim, when we look at these things, why did Islam come? بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألف لام را كتاب أنزلناه إليك لتخرج الناس من الظلمات إلى النور بإذن ربهم إلى صراط العزيز الحميد. The three letters Alif Lam Ra. This is a book we have revealed unto you, O Rasulullah, that you may take humanity from the darknesses, zulumat, which is not Islam, to Ilan Nur, the light of Islam. I.e., this is how you deal with the concept of oppression, and racism is oppression. Persecuting minority religious communities is oppression. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ said he would be a witness against people who harmed Ahlul Dhimma. When Umar ibn Khattab was dying, and is a long hadith which is narrated, I think, in the collection of Imam Bukhari, he said, be good to Ahlul Dhimma, don't tax them and harshly, and protect them. And there are many hadith. Just to conclude, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said in a hadith reported in the collection of Imam Ahmad, O people, your Lord is one, and your father Adam alayhi salam is one. There is no favor of an Arab over a foreigner, or a foreigner over an Arab, because there is some prejudice against Arabs. You hear that as well amongst non-Arab Muslims. That does not mean the majority of non-Arab Muslims are racist against Arabs, but it does exist. But the systems have got to deal with it. So the Prophet is reminding us, another white skin over black skin, or black skin over white skin. There's a lot of emphasis, except by righteousness have I not delivered the message. This is something which is delivered on the last the Hajj, when the Prophet ﷺ delivered this message. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Prophet ﷺ said in another hadith, where he said, no one is better than anyone else except by religion or good deeds. It is enough for evil, for a profane or vulgar or greedy or cowardly person. Profanity, vulgarity and greed. Greed is what drove the colonialism and the projects of these slave trade and so on. And in conclusion, Rasulullah said in another hadith reported in the collection of Abu Dawood, he is not one of us who calls to tribalism, things like nationalism and racism and so on. He is not the one who fights for such a thing as this. And Muhammad Ali famously refused to fight for American nationalism in Vietnam. He is not one of us who dies following the way of these things. So as Muslims, alhamdulillah, we look at this problem and we analyze whatever people offer us, things like CRT or other ideas, and we understand the nature of the problem, look at the theories and the ideas people are giving us to deal with these problems, to solve these problems, and then we subject them to the Islamic principles, the Islamic rules, the Islamic norms, because the deen of Islam is a comprehensive way of dealing with problems, with ideas, with thoughts, and it is not lacking. You, or many of us may not have the answers to a specific issue or problem, clearly, but the concept of Islam, so the ideas of Islam, the principles of Islam address all aspects, how to deal with racism, how to deal with prejudice, how to protect minorities, how best to eliminate problems at a systems level. Of course, you will never eliminate racism amongst Muslims or non-Muslims. There are good and bad human beings on this planet, just as there are good and bad Muslims, and we don't promise the world utopia. Because we know famously in Medina, when Rasulullah was asked to deal with an incident when Abu Dhar al-Ghifari attacked or insulted Bilal radiallahu an and mentioned his mother being black, and the Prophet ﷺ harshly rebuked him. And these were the greatest human beings who made mistakes. Mistakes will be made, but at a systems level, at the top end, dhulumat is all injustice. And injustices can be many. An-Nur, guidance, the deen of Islam is one. It is the best. That is not to say that Muslims are perfect, but when mistakes are made, they have to be corrected and dealt with in a way which achieves the justice for all of humanity. Because ultimately we will all return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu was so worried. He would say that if an animal is harmed, Umar ibn Khattab will be accounted for on Yawm al-Qiyamah. And when human beings are being harmed the world over, subhanAllah, look at what's going on. So as Muslims, we carry this responsibility and we must discharge it by enjoining the ma'roof and forbidding the munkar and calling to the correct answers and correct thoughts. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.